Before his death, Ray Charles finally names the 10 musicians he hated. Imagine being one of the greatest musical legends of all time. Your voice, your piano, your soul, redefining American sound, but your name still shadowed your truth, still muted, and your legacy quietly bruised by a system that applauded imitation over authenticity. Ray Charles never screamed into microphones. He didn't storm off stages or clap back on talk shows. But before he left this world in 2004, he whispered something far more dangerous than a headline. He named names. 10 of them. 10 artists, 10 voices, 10 icons that Ray could never forgive. This isn't your typical diss list. There's no Twitter beef, no backhanded interviews, no superficial drama. What Ray carried was heavier than hate. It was the unbearable weight of memory. A memory of being told his voice was too black for radio, while smoother, whiter voices climbed the same charts with the same songs. A memory of pouring his grief into the piano while others collected the praise for melodies born from pain they never lived. Elvis Presley, Pat Boone, Michael Bolton, Kenny G, George Harrison, Tina Marie, Christina Aguilera, Barry Manilow, Justin Timberlake. Even Billy Graham, a preacher not a musician, made the list. But why? What did they do to be remembered not with admiration but with sorrow and resistance? Ray didn't just sing songs, he sang his blindness, his poverty, his mother's struggle, and every inch of Southern pain that shaped him. So when others with polished voices and palatable faces sang the same tunes to him, it felt like theft in slow motion. This video isn't about canceling anyone. It's about understanding what happens when the soul of music is pushed aside in favor of spectacle. When voices rise on stages, they didn't build echoing stories they never lived. When perfection is praised more than truth. What did Ray Charles really think about the biggest names in soul pop and gospel? What truths did he hold close until the very end? And what do his final reflections reveal about an industry still struggling to honor the originators? Get ready to hear the names. Not from gossip, not from speculation, but from the mind of a man who saw everything, even without his eyes. This is not a rumor. This is not revenge. This is Ray Charles, finally telling the truth. If this story already has your heart pounding, don't forget to hit that like, leave a comment, and subscribe to Legends of Black Excellence, where we don't just tell stories, we remember what others forget. Ray Charles Robinson entered the world on September 23, 1930, in a one-room shack in the tiny hamlet of Greenville, Florida. His mother, Aretha Williams Robinson, was 17 and unmarried. His father, Bailey Robinson, was a wandering laborer who drifted from sawmill to sawmill. Poverty was not an abstract concept for the Robinson family. It was the air they breathed, the clay beneath their feet, the quiet question hanging over every sunrise. How will we make it to nightfall? Yet in that fragile beginning lay the seed of a voice that would one day shake the floorboards of American music. Ray's earliest memories were stitched together by two constants: hardship and sound. Outside their cabin, the red clay roads of North Florida carried the wail of freight trains and the chatter of field hands. Inside, his mother hummed spirituals as she washed clothes for white families. Music was never decoration. It was survival, a way to speak when fatigue made words too heavy. At 4, Ray stood at a rickety upright piano in the local cafe where Aretha sometimes cooked. He pounded the keys with small fists, intrigued less by melody than by vibration. The owner indulged the curious child, sliding a soda pop across the counter as payment. That clinking glass, the sticky sweet fizz, the laughter of patrons each became part of an unwritten score echoing in Ray's future work. Tragedy arrived early and mercilessly. When Ray was 5, he watched helplessly as his younger brother George slipped into a tub used for washing clothes and drowned. The image seared itself into his psyche, teaching him how instantly life could disappear. 2 years later, Ray's vision began to fade from what doctors later believed was juvenile glaucoma. By his 7th birthday, he was completely blind. Some communities might have folded under such weight, but in Greenville, church mothers and neighbors rallied. They taught Ray to identify every person by footstep, every door by creak, every breeze by scent. A skill set that later translated into an almost supernatural sensitivity to musical nuance. Aretha refused pity. She told Ray, "You're blind, but you ain't helpless. You gotta make your own way." She drilled independence into him. Tie your own shoes, find your own cup, mop the floor, by touch, not by sight. When neighbors offered charity, she waved them off. Those hard lessons forged the iron in Ray's spine and the blue flame determination that peppered his music. At 10, Ray was sent to the Florida School for the Deaf and the Blind in St. Augustine. There, he learned Braille algebra and classical piano under teachers who insisted on Bach before boogie-woogie. Ray drank it all in Chopin's melancholic etudes, the strict counterpoint of fugues, the brassy swagger of Duke Ellington records smuggled in by older students. He also devoured the new invention called radio, pressing his ear against the speaker until he could dissect entire horn charts in real time. Yet even there, racism drew rigid lines. Black students rehearsed in old practice rooms and were barred from the school orchestra. Ray responded, as he always would, by refusing to be small. He formed a campus band, translating popular swing tunes into Braille charts and performing them flawlessly at Friday dances. Crowds packed the gym, segregation be damned. Music, he realized, could elbow its way through walls that laws tried to keep standing. When Aretha died in 1945, Ray, only 15, was orphaned, devastated but unmoved in purpose. He boarded a Greyhound bound for Jacksonville, and then Tallahassee, Sampson, and Orlando, playing any upright piano that hadn't collapsed and sleeping on wooden benches between sets. He earned $3 a night, sometimes supper, sometimes nothing at all. Those lean miles refined his timing. He could read a room by its breathing sense, whether dancers needed swing or a slow blues bleed. That sensitivity later informed his studio work, where one misphrased syllable could decide whether a ballad soared or fell flat. In 1948, lured by a letter from a fellow musician, Ray headed as far from the Jim Crow South as a $20 bus ticket would carry him Seattle, Washington. The city's Jackson Street scene was a stew of bebop, jump blues, and Naval Yard money. Ray teamed up with guitarist Gossie McKee and bassist Milton Gaird to form the Maxson Trio, a clever nod to McKee and Son with Ray as the son. They patterned themselves after Nat King Cole's piano-guitar-bass format, but injected a dirt road rawness Cole never dared. Their gigs at the Rocking Chair, the Washington Social Club, and even an impromptu slot on radio station KOL built a loyal local following. Seattle also introduced Ray to modern recording technology. His first single Confession Blues cut for Downbeat Records in 1949 cracked Billboard's R&B Top 5. The taste of national attention convinced him it was time to confront the industry's epicenter, Los Angeles. The LA scene introduced darker realities: exploitative contracts, payola, and the ever-present narcotics pipeline coursing through after-hours clubs. Ray observed, learned, and tried to keep his head above the undertow. When he signed with Ahmet Ertegun and Jerry Wexler's Atlantic Records in 1952, he negotiated for artistic freedom before he negotiated for money. But arriving at a signature sound took trial and error. Early Atlantic sides showed him mimicking Charles Brown's soft croon and Nat Cole's polished diction, competent yet derivative. Then, during a juke joint gig in New Orleans, he let a guttural moan slip across the microphone. The band stuttered, the dancers gasped, and that was the lightning strike. Ray fused gospel call and response with the swampy tremble of Delta blues and the bawdy swing of Kansas City jazz. The result was I Got a Woman in 1954, a record so shocking that churches condemned it from pulpits, even as nightclubs wore the vinyl thin. From there, the hits rolled in like boxcars. Hallelujah, I Love Her, So What Did I Say, Drown in My Own Tears. Each track blurred sacred and secular lines until they were indistinguishable. Ray's voice wasn't pretty. It was truthful, cracked with worldly dust, Yet he framed it with horns that flared like Sunday trumpets and female backing vocals that echoed storefront sanctuaries. For audiences starved for authenticity, the sound was irresistible. For gatekeepers frightened of interracial dance floors, it was dangerous. Radio stations in some southern markets banned the records. Ray accepted the bans as badges. Every prohibition meant he had touched a nerve. Offstage, Ray's iron independence stiffened into outright rebellion against segregation. In 1961, when a promoter insisted he play to a whites-only audience in Augusta, Georgia, he tore up the contract and left town. The venue sued. Ray paid the fine and doubled down, refusing segregated bookings thereafter. That single decision cost him thousands in lost gigs, but earned him lifelong stature in the civil rights community. He also waged a quieter battle for ownership. In 1962, newly signed to ABC Paramount, Ray negotiated a then unprecedented clause, granting him ownership of his master recordings after 7 years, a deal later envied and emulated by countless artists from Prince to Taylor Swift. The label balked, but Ray held firm. He understood that the real revolution wasn't merely musical, but economic. Fame did not dull the ache that first found him on those North Florida dirt roads. Heroin slipped into his life in the early 1950s, initially as a balm for road weariness, soon as a chain. He was arrested for possession in 1961, again in 1964, narrowly avoiding prison by agreeing to clinic-based rehabilitation. Critics predicted the arrests would end his career. Instead, they sharpened his resolve. Within a year of kicking heroin, he recorded Georgia on My Mind, a cerebral strings-laced ode to the state that once denied him restrooms. The song won 4 Grammy Awards and later became the official state anthem, a poetic twist Aretha would have savored. Ray's personal life was equally complex. He married Della Beatrice Howard in 1955, but extramarital affairs produced a total of 12 children with 9 women. The contradictions were glaring. On stage, he preached honesty. Off stage, he juggled secrets. Yet even in domestic chaos, Ray remained devoted to family funding college educations for each child and visiting between tours. Those visits sometimes doubled as crash courses in music history, with Ray seated at the piano teaching 12-bar blues progressions by ear. By the late 1960s, critics crowned Ray the genius for his ability to transmute any genre, country, big band, even show tunes, into Charlesian gold. His 1962 album, Modern Sounds in Country and Western Music, shocked purists and delighted record buyers, selling over 1 million copies. Ray's cover of I Can't Stop Loving You topped both pop and R&B charts, shattering the myth that audiences would not accept a black artist singing hillbilly ballads. When naysayers cried cultural heresy, Ray shrugged. Good music is good music, he said, echoing the philosophy that had carried him from the dirt floors of Greenville to Carnegie Hall. Success allowed Ray to dream bigger than his next single. He formed Tangerine Records, signing acts like the Raylettes and Percy Mayfield, and built RPM International Studios in Los Angeles, where he acted as producer-arranger and mentor. He accumulated rare collector pianos, invested in real estate ventures, and eventually controlled a multi-million-dollar empire, an astonishing feat for a black musician who once rode segregated buses to gigs. Philanthropy followed prosperity. In 1986, Ray donated $2 million to endow the Ray Charles Chair of System Design Engineering at the University of Washington, the institution that had first given him honorary degrees for his contributions to music and civil rights. He funded hearing and vision clinics, remembering every denied doctor visit of his rural childhood. The 1990s found Ray decorated with honors. Kennedy Center accolades, the National Medal of Arts induction into multiple halls of fame. Yet beneath every standing ovation was the echo of fights still unfinished over artistic ownership, over racial fairness, over the right to be heard without filters. Those old wounds resurfaced when journalists asked him about younger, blue-eyed soul stars or slick jazz instrumentalists flooding radio playlists. Polite but piercing Ray reminded them and the industry that technique without history was decoration, not art. When liver disease compounded by decades of touring and diabetes confined him to his Beverly Hills home in early 2004, Ray confronted mortality the way he had confronted every other obstacle head-on. He summoned friends, journalists, and protégés, granting raw interviews in which he spoke less about money and awards than about authenticity, about the 10 names that symbolized everything he believed was still broken in music. He rehearsed, recorded, and even laughed in those last months, but the subtext was clear. If he could no longer sit at a piano under hot lights, he would use his final breath to defend the soul he had spent a lifetime rescuing from neglect. Ray Charles died on June 10, 2004. At the funeral held at the First African Methodist Episcopal Church of Los Angeles, BB, King wept openly. Stevie Wonder sang, "I Won't Complain," and the congregation rocked in a sanctified swing that blurred the line between church service and juke joint jubilee exactly as Ray would have wanted. Flags flew at half-staff across Georgia. Congress praised him as a national treasure. Yet for all the tributes, the truest monument to Ray Charles remains the music that refuses to sit still, that still vibrates with red clay sorrow and shot glass jubilation, that still demands honesty in a world quick to settle for impersonation. That is the man behind the myth, the orphan who turned pain into prophecy, the blind pianist who taught a seeing nation how to hear the businessman who negotiated freedom note by note. Understanding this journey is essential before we examine why Ray could never forgive those 10 names he uttered near the very end. Names that for him embodied systems of erasure, imitation, and polished soullessness. By the time Ray Charles reached national fame, he had already endured a lifetime's worth of pain, injustice, and survival. And yet it was precisely those scars, each one unhidden, unapologetic, that carved the unique voice the world came to know. Ray didn't rise like a rocket. He clawed his way upward through segregation blindness, poverty, addiction, and rejection. But when he finally broke through, he did so with a force so undeniable that even the most resistant gatekeepers of the music industry had to make room. The seeds of fame were planted far from the glare of television studios or New York jazz halls. They were planted in smoke-filled juke joints in rented rooms where 3 musicians crammed onto a corner stage playing for tips applause or on lucky nights both. In the late 1940s, Ray, alongside Gossie McKee and Milton Garrett, formed the McSon Trio and toured the Pacific Northwest. These gigs, though small in size, shaped Ray's discipline and gave him the space to develop something more than talent identity. At this point, Ray was still mirroring the style of Nat King Cole and Charles Brown's smooth, articulate jazzy, but the imitation was only skin deep. Audiences began to notice something strange. Even when playing familiar tunes, Ray's phrasing carried a grit, a pull that felt spiritual. He'd stretch syllables longer than expected, drop into a blues growl at the exact moment a line turned personal, and use silence like punctuation. The sound wasn't fully formed, but it was beginning to become his. In 1949, the trio released Confession Blues under the name Maxine Trio. To everyone's surprise, it broke into the R&B top 5. It was a modest but meaningful win, a signal that the industry was beginning to hear something new in Ray's voice. Yet even with that success, Ray struggled to find his next big break. His early recordings for Swingtime Records in Los Angeles were technically solid, but lacked the soul-infused fire that would later define him. He was still searching for his true musical fingerprint. That changed in 1952 when Ahmet Ertegun and Jerry Wexler of Atlantic Records heard him perform live and offered him a contract. More than just a label deal, it was an artistic partnership built on trust. Atlantic gave Ray something rare: creative control. It was an unusual arrangement for a young black artist in the 1950s, but Ray made good on the risk. Within months, he began sculpting what would soon be recognized as the Ray Charles sound. In 1954, everything changed with the release of I Got a Woman. The song, built around a gospel hymn, shocked audiences by marrying sacred rhythms with secular lyrics. Churches condemned it as blasphemy. Record stores debated whether to stock it, but listeners, They couldn't get enough. The song shot up the charts, becoming Ray's first true hit and marking the birth of soul music as a commercial genre. Ray had found his formula mix, the emotional depth of gospel with the raw truth of blues and the swing of jazz, then lace it all together with lyrics about real, imperfect human experiences. Songs like "Drown in My Own Tears," "Hallelujah, I Love Her So," and "This Little Girl of Mine" followed, each one pushing the boundaries of what black music could be, and fame didn't insulate Ray from America's harsh racial realities. During the 1950s and early 60s, he often toured the segregated South, playing to audiences split by skin color, staying in black-owned motels, and eating in back kitchens. But instead of avoiding confrontation, Ray leaned into it. He refused to play segregated shows. When a promoter in Augusta, Georgia insisted that black patrons sit in the balcony, Ray canceled the concert and left the state. The promoter sued him. Ray paid the fine and never looked back. This act of quiet protest, long before such resistance became mainstream, earned Ray a place in the civil rights movement. He wasn't marching on Washington, but in his own way he was disrupting systems of injustice stage by stage, night by night. In 1959, Ray dropped one of his most iconic singles, "What Did I Say?" Originally a stage improvisation, the song exploded in popularity despite being considered overtly sexual for its time. With its call and response breakdown, suggestive moaning, and relentless groove, the track broke through the R&B barrier and crossed into the pop charts, something very few black artists had done at the time. Ray was no longer just a jazz pianist or R&B singer. He had become a crossover sensation, drawing fans from all racial and musical backgrounds. His appeal lay not in compromise, but in authenticity. He didn't tone down his voice or dilute his lyrics. If anything, he doubled down on honesty, something that was both his weapon and his truth. By the early 1960s, Ray's influence had spread far beyond the studio. He headlined the Apollo, the Fillmore, the Hollywood Bowl. He toured Europe, performing before audiences who didn't understand English but still felt every note. In Paris, critics called him the Black Mozart. In London, he inspired a young generation of musicians from Mick Jagger to Elton John, who would later cite him as the single greatest influence on their sound. Just when critics tried to box Ray into soul, he kicked the box open. In 1962, he released Modern Sounds in Country and Western Music, an album that stunned everyone. A black artist recording country standards. It sounded absurd until it sold over 1 million copies. His version of "I Can't Stop Loving You" topped both the pop and R&B charts and became one of his biggest commercial hits. Ray didn't just cover country songs, he transformed them. By bringing gospel inflection and bluesy vulnerability into Nashville's polished melodies, he revealed the shared emotional DNA between black and white musical traditions. In doing so, he bridged two cultural worlds that had long stood apart. He followed it with orchestral ballads, jazz albums, and even show tunes. Whether backed by a full-string section or a simple trio, Ray's voice remained the focal point, trembling, broken, defiant, and alive. His 1966 performance of "America the Beautiful" turned the patriotic standard into a spiritual epic filled with ache and hope. When he sang that song, it didn't sound like a tribute to a country. It sounded like a plea for its conscience. Ray wasn't just a performer, he was a pioneer in ownership. In his 1962 contract with ABC Paramount, he negotiated not only for artistic control, but also for ownership of his master recordings, a groundbreaking demand for a black artist at the time. That single clause ensured that Ray could earn royalties on his terms, setting a precedent that other artists would fight for decades later. He also launched his own label, Tangerine Records, and began producing other artists. His studio, RPM International in Los Angeles, became a creative hub where he experimented with genres, arrangements, and vocal styles. Behind the scenes, Ray was just as innovative as he was in the spotlight. Ray's refusal to conform earned him both admiration and alienation. He declined countless offers to collaborate with artists whose voices he found hollow. He refused interviews that tried to paint him as a tragic figure. and he turned down awards when he felt they were more symbolic than sincere. But Ray also endured. He toured relentlessly, sometimes performing 200 nights a year. He showed up to rehearsals when younger artists canceled. He never lip-synced, never faked, never phoned it in. His concerts were sermons, and his band, the Raylettes, knew better than to miss a cue. If you don't feel it, Ray once told them, the audience won't feel a damn thing. He also mentored a generation. Stevie Wonder, Quincy Jones, Aretha Franklin. They all traced some part of their artistry back to Ray. He was the lighthouse that showed what could be done, not just musically, but ethically. A man who had nothing then, something then, everything, and never lost the flame of the boy from Greenville who just wanted to be heard. Fame, however, was no shield. Ray battled heroin addiction for nearly 2 decades before finally quitting in the 1960s. He lost friends, alienated lovers, and struggled with his own demons. He was complex, a man capable of deep love and emotional distance, of generosity and stubborn pride. His personal relationships were messy, his emotional life often guarded. But in the music it all came out. You could hear his regrets in Come Rain or Come Shine, his longing in You Don't Know Me, his fury in Busted. His voice didn't sing notes. It confessed sins, whispered prayers, and shouted refusals. By the 1980s, Ray was no longer topping charts, but his legacy had crystallized. He was no longer the new sound, he was the standard. Awards poured in the Kennedy Center, honors the National Medal of Art's multiple lifetime achievement accolades. He even performed for presidents. But perhaps the most telling moment came when Georgia declared, "Georgia on My Mind," its official state song decades after it once wouldn't play him on the radio. Even as his body weakened, Ray stayed on tour, stayed in the studio, stayed vocal about the industry's failures. He watched as younger, shinier, safer voices claimed the genre he had carved from raw wood and fire. He didn't name names then, not publicly. But those who knew him say he carried a list of voices he couldn't forgive, not for singing, but for what they stood for. That list, the one we're about to explore, wasn't a vendetta. It was a eulogy. A final act of defiance from a man who had spent his entire life building something real in an industry full of replicas. A warning that soul, once diluted, might never come back. Ray Charles was called many things in his lifetime. The genius, the high priest of soul, a trailblazer, an icon. But behind the stage lights, behind the dark glasses and that electrifying grin, lived a man whose pain never quite left the room. His music carried the thunder of survival, but his life off stage was filled with silent contradictions and a deep spiritual fatigue. Ray's dark side wasn't theatrical. It didn't unfold in front of flashing cameras or scream for attention. It showed itself in the choices he made when no one was watching. It whispered through his solitude, his relationships, and the way he quietly carried betrayal. Especially the betrayal of a system that embraced his voice while distancing itself from his truth. For Ray, blindness wasn't just physical, it became symbolic. He often spoke about seeing with his ears, but there were some things he never wanted to hear again. The splash of his little brother drowning the hum of racism in the segregated South, the sound of radio stations playing other men's versions of songs he knew by heart. These traumas, buried beneath his success, haunted him well into his final years. In public, Ray radiated control. But in private, he lived under the weight of unresolved grief. His mother's death when he was just 15 left a wound that never fully closed. She was his teacher, protector, compass, and the last person who ever demanded he be strong for no one but himself. After she died, Ray hardened. He rarely cried. He rarely confided. Instead, he played. Ray's 2-decade battle with heroin wasn't a tabloid scandal, it was a quiet war. He wasn't the rock star found passed out in hotel lobbies. He was the man who hit every note on stage, then returned to his dressing room to shoot up alone. Addiction for Ray was less about euphoria and more about anesthesia. He once admitted in a rare moment of vulnerability, "It helped me shut the world out." The arrests began in 1961. In a time when most black men didn't walk away from narcotics charges, Ray faced the court and negotiated a treatment-centered sentence instead of prison time. He cleaned up, but the damage lingered in his personal life, in his music, and in the way he viewed trust. Heroin wasn't the only addiction. Ray had 12 children with 9 different women. He loved all his children but struggled with consistency. His relationships were intense, short-lived, and often filled with emotional distance. He could love you from a piano bench. But beyond the music, he could be elusive even absent. The most deeply buried wound in Ray Charles's life had nothing to do with drugs or death. It was the way the music industry polished up black sounds, put them in white packages, and shipped them out with bigger budgets and louder applause. Ray called it what it was: betrayal. When he heard Michael Bolton belt soul ballads that once got Ray banned from the airwaves, he didn't shout. He went quiet. When he saw Kenny G topping jazz charts with sterilized saxophone solos while Miles Davis's legacy was fading from younger playlists, he didn't argue. He mourned. Ray never hated these artists as people. His issue was bigger than that. It was about erasure. It was about watching the soul stripped from the music and replaced with shine. He told friends that the industry sold flavor, but erased the recipe. That's what fueled his private list, the 10 names that represented everything he had fought against. He didn't hate their success. He hated what their success cost. Ray was one of the first black artists to own his master recordings, something nearly unheard of in the 1960s. It wasn't ego, it was defense. He had watched too many of his peers die penniless while others made millions off their voices. He refused to become another name buried in a footnote. That fierce independence isolated him. Industry executives labeled him difficult. Collaborators complained about his control. But Ray wasn't controlling out of arrogance. He had survived a system designed to chew up black genius and spit out forgettable profit. If he didn't guard his legacy, who would? He also guarded his privacy. There were no major autobiographies during his lifetime, no tell-all documentaries. When he did speak, it was brief-coded heavy with subtext. Even his final interviews were more about soul as a concept than about Ray as a man. On June 10, 2004, Ray Charles passed away in Beverly Hills at the age of 73 due to complications from liver disease. There was no conspiracy, no mystery. His death came quietly in a home filled with sunlight and music. But what lingered was not how he died, it was what he left behind. He didn't leave a list of who got what. His legacy wasn't in property or jewelry. It was in truth. Before he died, he recorded interviews, notes, and reflections about what he believed had gone wrong in the industry and what still needed to be said. He knew he wouldn't be around forever. But his voice, that would outlive every clean imitation. His funeral was a celebration, a homegoing, a defiant affirmation that black music, real black music, still mattered. Stevie Wonder cried, Aretha sang, politicians showed up. But the loudest voice in the room was Ray's, echoing through his recordings like a ghost demanding respect. Ray didn't name names for revenge. He did it because the system that lifted his music often refused to lift his people. He wanted the world to understand that music without struggle was entertainment, not art. That's why he couldn't embrace artists who had never bled into their songs. That's why he refused to call them soul. To him, soul was a life lived in full view of loss. He was never interested in being anyone's hero, but he demanded to be remembered honestly, not as a saint, not as a saint-sinner, but as a man who gave everything he had: flaws, fury, beauty, and blood to keep the truth of music alive. And so in his final days, he wrote down 10 names, 10 artists who represented the parts of the industry that pained him most. They weren't his enemies. They were warnings. Warnings for future generations not to lose the raw truth in pursuit of perfection. Warnings that even the most polished voices might be echoing someone else's pain. Warnings that imitation is not homage when it erases the original. Ray Charles didn't leave this world with bitterness in his voice. He left with conviction. His life was never about hate. It was about holding the line for truth in a world that constantly blurred it. And in his final act, he gave us not just a list of names, but a mirror. A mirror reflecting the painful divide between talent and truth, between recognition and roots. He never screamed these names across tabloids. He whispered them in private interviews, tucked them into scribbled notes, delivered them in glances and silences that spoke louder than applause. Elvis Presley, Pat Boone, Michael Bolton, Kenny G, Tina Marie, George Harrison, Justin Timberlake, Christina Aguilera, Barry Manilow, even Billy Graham. What united them wasn't race or genre. It was what Ray believed they lacked: the scars that made a voice worth listening to. He wasn't attacking individuals, he was indicting a system that celebrated echoes while ignoring originators. He wasn't jealous of their fame, he was wounded by what it cost the pioneers who came before. To Ray, music was never just sound. It was memory. It was protest. It was love buried in heartbreak and hope rising from injustice. That's why he couldn't forgive the smoothness that erased the struggle. That's why he couldn't hear soul in a voice that never trembled from being too hungry, too tired, too unseen. In the end, his legacy wasn't a mansion or a platinum plaque. It was a challenge to feel more deeply, to listen more honestly, to remember the voices that cracked the ceiling long before it became fashionable to sing soulfully in front of one. So what does it say about us? If we continue to forget, if this story stirred something in you, if it made you think twice about who gets credit, who gets remembered, and who gets erased, then we ask you to do just one thing. Don't let real stories fade. Don't let real voices be buried beneath polished imitations. This is Legends of Black Excellence, where history is honored, truth is protected, and voices like Ray Charles are never silenced. Like this video, subscribe and tap the notification bell to stay connected with the real stories, the buried truths, and the legacies that shaped the soundtracks of our lives. And drop a comment below. Which name on Ray's list surprised you most? And do you think soul music today still carries soul? Or just style?